I must begin with a qualified apology. This seems like such a gloomy, morose branding for these 4 Psalms. The manual on how to suffer. And my original idea was, man, we're going to be in the Psalms, and we'll return to the Psalms maybe every spring, and we'll call it something like a walk in the Psalms, and it'll have greenery. And I was thinking like, Psalm 23 vibes. Still waters, green pastures, being led along the path by God. But then I got dug into Psalm chapter 4 and Psalm 5 and Psalm 6 and Psalm 7, and I saw that vibe does not work for these Psalms. These are Psalms of lament. This quartet of Psalms has a different tone. In them, David models righteous lament, born out of his personal experience in fleeing his palace in his old age, abandoning his throne after all his enemies were seemingly killed. His son of all people rose up against him, started a rebellion, staged a coup, and in his fleeing from the palace, David experiences these psalms, and in his heart they begin to be written. So we need these psalms as much as we need the sunny psalms. And in these psalms, David gives us sort of a manual on how to suffer righteously. And in Psalm chapter 4, just to kind of give you an overview of where we're going to be in these 4 weeks, in Psalm chapter 4, this is modeled for us, how we lament. Psalm chapter 4, he's calling out to God. He's saying, Lord, answer me. I need you to hear me in my suffering. And then in Psalm 5, he says, lead me. While I'm waiting to hear from you, you need to lead me. I don't know which way to go. Psalm 6, he's calling out to God to deliver me. And in Psalm 5 and Psalm 6, I just hear echoing. I shared this passage with a few people this week. 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 12. God's people were surrounded. And it says, in that they call out to God in a prayer, and they say, we are powerless against this horde. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. That's essentially the prayer in Psalm 5 and Psalm 6. So he says, answer me, lead me, deliver me. And then in Psalm 7, he says, inspect me. And we're going to see that in a few weeks. He uses the word judge me, but the idea is inspect me, look at me. And he says in verse 8 of Psalm 7, the Lord judges the peoples. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and according to the integrity that is in me. But then he ends in verse 17, I will give to the Lord the thanks due to his righteousness, and I will sing the praise of the name of the Lord the Most High. And so he ends this time of suffering, calling out to God for an answer, to be led, to be delivered. But then in the end, he says, I invite your scrutiny, Lord. I want you to examine me. I want you to search me and know my heart. I want you to test me, try me, and know my thoughts, and examine me and see if there's any wicked way in me. And in this, we see at the end of all this, David essentially is saying, I'm praying for more of Christ's righteousness to have a hold of me now than when this turmoil first began. So let's crack open the manual. Let's begin in Psalm 4. We're going to cover Psalm 4 today, and let's read it. It's in entirety. Psalm 4, beginning in verse 1. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your bed and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, who will show us some good? Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Now, Psalm 4 is kind of a partner psalm to Psalm 3, calling out to God. Psalm 3 has the title there that it's a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom. Psalm 3 is known as a morning psalm, and Psalm 4 an evening hymn, because in Psalm 3 very mirrors the calls that he has in Psalm 4, but in verse 5 of Psalm 3 he says, I lay down and I slept, I woke again, for the Lord has sustained me. And then here in verse 8 of Psalm 4, in peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. And so let's just kind of get an overview of this psalm, stanza by stanza. This is a poem. Let's get a picture of it. Just look at all 8 of these verses. And in verse 1, first of all, we see a prayer is offered to God. Answer me when I call. A prayer is offered to God, and prayer must be, it must be our reflexive response to turmoil in our life. When you go to the doctor and you sit at the table and he hits your knee with the hammer, something's wrong if your knee doesn't spring forward. In the life of the believer, when turmoil is introduced into our life, something is wrong if you don't reflexively call out to God in prayer. David calls out to God in prayer and says, answer me, O God of my righteousness. That's important. Because right off the bat, he's declaring, God, I know you're good. I'm calling out to you. I'm not claiming to have been mistreated. You didn't do me any wrong because you are righteous. Nevertheless, I have to call out to you in this moment. Notice also he says, you have given me relief when I was in distress. So also, just instinctively, David has past experience that provides present hope. Instantly, he recalls those God moments in his life where, man, I've been in this situation before. Maybe not exactly like this, but something similar to this. And when I called out to you then, you answered. So now, Lord, I'm calling out to you again, and I'm asking you to answer me. Notice also in this verse 1, he says, be gracious to me and hear my prayer. That's important too. He identifies God's righteousness. He identifies God's previous provision for him. But now he says, I'm asking for grace. That means, hey, I don't deserve this. I'm not demanding this of you. I'm not saying you owe this to me, God. What I'm saying is, you're under no obligation to help me. And I am definitely not worthy for the help. But nevertheless, I'm calling out to you, God. I need to hear from you now. So that's in verse 1. And then if you look down at verses 7 and 8, verse 1 you have the prayer offered. In verse 7 and 8 you have the prayer answered. But what I'm interested in is what takes place between the two. What happens between when the prayer is offered and the prayer is answered? That's what I need to know. What thoughts do you have when you're waiting on God to answer a prayer? What feelings should you be feeling? What emotions might you experience? What actions should you take? That gap, that small little gap, and sometimes it's a big gap, but that gap between, Lord, I'm calling out to you, and wow, God came through and He answered, that gap between the two, it's like a mail slot that just drops right into your heart. And in that opportunity, Satan loves to deliver doubts, despair, fear, faithlessness, bitterness, and he'll drop it right into that mail slot. And you might think, well, Lord, if you just were to answer the prayer a little quicker, that mail slot would snap shut, and Lord, you wouldn't be giving Satan so much opportunity in my life. But what we have to realize is that mail slot, that distance between calling out to God and God answering, that's when God silently rolls up His sleeves and He starts getting His fingernails dirty and He begins doing a work in you. Because you are a divine He is the divine craftsman working on your life so that His glory might be known, so that the image of His Son might be on display in your character and your conduct and in your choices. And so lest you be too anxious to get that prayer answered right away and snap that mail slot shut, just remember, that's when God really delivers the goods. And so I want to look at those 6 or so verses between the two of what happens between calling out to God and getting the answer from God. So let's take quick note of what happens in verses 2 through 6. In that we see, verse 2, continued distress. He says, "O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies?" So we must not unreasonably expect instantaneous results when we call out to God in time of distress. And not just instantaneous results, but instantaneous results that are according to our preferences. God's not a genie in a lamp, and prayer's not rubbing that lamp for Him to come out and do whatever you beckon Him to do. He's working on a different and a better agenda than what we're aware of. So in verse 2 we see continued distress. In verse 3, despite this continued distress, in verse 3 we see confidence declared. David says, "But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for Himself." Even though I don't see anything happening right now, he says, the Lord hears when I call to Him. And then in verses 4 and 5, he gives some commands. In verse 6, he notes some contrast between those whom the Lord hears and those whom He doesn't hear. So that's what takes place between the prayers. But with that overview in mind, I want to really zero in. And just, I want to learn, what am I supposed to do in that gap between calling out to God and just hearing a distinct answer, observing God making a way when there doesn't seem to be a way. When I'm waiting on that, what am I supposed to do? And according to this divine manual, after I plead for an answer, before God answers, I see that I need to righteously model my lament like David did. And here we see David piloted for us 4 behaviors to be reproduced in our lives. The prayer's gone up. Now what do I do? 4 behaviors that we can model in our life based on verses 2 through 6. The first behavior is this: you need to endure continued suffering. The call to endurance. So difficult. So repeated throughout Scripture, the call to endurance. As I said, we can't demand or expect immediate results. Note what David endured. He says, "How long shall my honor be turned into shame?" David was suffering shameful, embarrassing dishonor. David was experiencing betrayal of the highest order. In his old age, David is experiencing monumental setback. Remember, he was anointed king while the other king was still on the throne. And then he fled for his life for much of the first portion of his reign. Finally, he gets on the throne, and now this. And we see an account of this in 2 Samuel. Just listen to the shame that he experiences. In 2 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 13 it says, "And a messenger came to David saying, 'The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom,'" that's the son of David. "Then David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, 'Arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly and bring down ruin on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword.' And the king's servant said to the king, 'Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king decides.' So the king went out, and all of his household after him, and the king left 10 concubines to keep the house." And by the way, Absalom went and erected a tent on top of the palace and publicly slept with David's wives to further shame him. "And the king," in verse 17, "went out, and all the people after him, and they halted at the last house." We look at verse 30. It says, "But David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot, with his head covered, not very kingly. He's in great distress. His head is covered, his feet are bare, he's weeping, and all the people are weeping with him. This is what David is experiencing when he says, "O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame?" Some of you may have experienced that kind of a walk, barefoot, head covered, weeping. Maybe it was a walk away from a broken relationship, a marriage that came to a conclusion, or a child-sized coffin. We can all identify in some capacity, some much greater than others, with the shame, the grief, the bitterness that David is enduring at this time. And notice he says, "How long?" It's the uncertainty, isn't it? The uncertainty of how long am I going to be subjected to this that makes that weight just so unbearable. And it's in that waiting that we have to have humility. Again, David demonstrates tremendous humility and this unknowing, this uncertainty. In David's fleeing, he didn't know when or if he was going to be back. He didn't know, is this coming from the hand of God? Is this coming from my own sins? Is this coming from satanic opposition? In fact, when he's fleeing, they bring out the Ark of the Covenant with them. And then David said, "Carry the Ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see both it and his dwelling place. But if he says, I have no pleasure in you, behold, here I am. Let him do to me what seems good to him." He wasn't going to take the Ark of the Covenant with him. He didn't know. And he didn't know if he would ever be back or if he would be back, but he was casting himself on God. Another example of this humility we see in the next chapter. As they're making their way out of the city, you have this man named Shimei, and he begins to curse David. He starts to throw rocks at them as this procession is leaving town, fleeing. He's up on the hilltop, they're down in the valley. He's throwing rocks at them and throwing dust at them, and he's saying to them, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood. And then one of David's right-hand men said, we're going to let this dog curse you? Let me go up there and take his head off. And David says, behold, he says, what have I to do with you? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, curse David, who then shall say, why have you done so? And David said to Abishai and to all his servants, behold, my own son seeks my life. How much more now this Benjamite? Leave him alone and let him curse. For the Lord perhaps has told him to do so. It may be that the Lord will look on the wrong done to me, and the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today. But David didn't know. And in humility, he's like, I'm not going to judge this guy. Obviously, he hates me, but man, maybe the Lord has sent him. I don't know. I'm not even sure if I'm in the right or in the wrong. But Lord, right now, I'm calling out to you, and all I can do is endure. In this verse, notice verse 2, he says, how long will you love vain words and seek after lies? Perhaps the words of Shimei on his mind as he pens this poem. And everyone here, not one of you here has not endured a vain word or a lie lobbed at you like a grenade over the neighbor's bushes. Someone saying something about you that's not true, or just a word that characterizes you in a way that's not accurate. You've endured it. We've all endured it. This is what David endured to the nth degree. And yet, you must endure the continued suffering. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9 says, do not grow weary, for in due season you will reap if you faint not. You've got to endure. And in the season, when the time is right, you may not know when, but it'll happen. Hebrews chapter 12 in verse 1 says, to run your race with endurance. The race that is set before you. I'm not going to run the race set before Amanda. I'm not going to run the race set before Dan. I'm called to my race. and I got to run it with endurance. So if I'm going to model godly lament after I call out to God, I must endure continued suffering. The second behavior that David pilots for us in this psalm to reproduce in our lives, in verse 3, we need to express confidence in God. Express confidence in God. David, in a sense, is saying, though my present circumstances may not indicate it to you, I know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself, and the Lord hears when I call to him. It is very important that in our endurance, in our suffering, while we wait for God to respond, that we express confidence in God. Not just for us to hear, but for others to hear as well. This theme just runs through Scripture so prevalently. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29, let no corrupt talk come out of your mouth, but only that is good for the building up. Only that which is fitting for the present circumstances. Only that which gives grace to the hearers. Psalm 19:14, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus said, at the time of judgment, you're going to have to give an account for every careless word that you speak. So be careful in those times of suffering that you don't say something carelessly that you don't really believe. Psalm 141 and verse 3, David says, set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth, and keep watch over the door of my lips. So David is expressing confidence in God, even in his distress, even when it seems like God's not answering, even in his enduring. And when is such adoration most valuable? Isn't it? When it's most tested? To declare good things about God in a time when he seems to be silent. I can remember back a time in our marriage. So we've been married how many years now, Rachel? This is 2022, so 21 years? 21 years this fall, right? There we go. I got it. But that's a long time. We've had some dark passages in that time. Almost always a result of me. Never her. I think there's been some outside circumstances. But there's been a season in my life where we weren't in the right place. I wasn't doing the right thing. And I was depressed. And I wasn't speaking. And she didn't know what was going on. And I would come home from work, and I was working weird hours. It was a difficult job. Nothing was rewarding. And I'd come home, and I just wouldn't speak to her. And she stuck with me. And she would do little things to care for me, even though I wasn't giving her anything. And she would love me and provide for me, and she was just patiently waiting for me. And if she could love me through that, I know, man, I've got a good woman here that loves me. She doesn't love me for, the hunk that I am. She doesn't love me for those vacations I take her out to on the weekend to Greece or, Panama, or the yacht I gave her for Valentine's Day. No. She loves me. I don't know for what, but if she can love me at my worst, then I know she loves me. And when we express true things about God, and we honor Him and worship Him and exalt Him, even when it seems He's not giving anything back, that's valuable. That's precious in His sight. That's how He knows this child belongs to me. And you will get rewarded. He will answer you in due time when the season comes. But in the meantime, don't fail to express your confidence in God, knowing also that your enemies are watching, and Satan and his demonic horde is watching, just like they did in the times of Job. And you don't want anyone to use your suffering as a reason to curse God. So express your confidence in Him. The third behavior we find in verses 4 and 5. Not only must we endure continued suffering, not only must we express confidence in God, but we must exhort others to righteousness in our time of waiting. He addresses these ungodly people. He addresses others that aren't behaving properly. In verse 4 and 5, he says, be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. Be angry and do not sin. This anger, it's the idea of being troubled, quaking, irritated, provoked, trembling, like water that's disturbed by an earthquake. He's like, when your life is like that, don't bellow out to God. Don't yell at Him. Don't declare indignation. Just sit on your bed, ponder it in your hearts, and be silent. The silence of the righteous rings more loudly and more clearly in your Father's ear than all the indignant bellows of the insolent. And so, we must endure, and we must exhort others to righteousness while we ourselves fight for it. It's very interesting, this verse. Does that sound familiar to you? Be angry and do not sin. Be angry and sin not. That's from Ephesians chapter 4, verses 25 to 27. And in that passage, all these themes from this psalm are brought up. I mean, Paul is essentially just preaching Psalm 4 in Ephesians chapter 4. We always take that exhortation, be angry and don't sin, don't let the sun go down upon your wrath, as a marriage verse, right? But here it's very clear. He's saying when you don't seem to hear an answer from God, don't be angry, don't sin, don't accuse God of anything, and don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Sleep in peace, which is where David eventually ends up in verse 8. But also notice in Ephesians chapter 4, he characterizes that not letting the sun go down upon your wrath, he characterizes it as giving no opportunity for Satan. So if we fail to follow these behaviors modeled by David, we are giving Satan opportunity in our lives. We must exhort others to righteousness, even as we wait for God to respond. The offering right sacrifices, I think throughout the Psalms, those sacrifices are often a reference to prayer going up to God. And then in verse 6, we see this final behavior that we need to model, and that is we need to expect a real difference. In verse 6, he says, there are many who say, who will show us some good? Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. But then in verse 7, he contrasts himself with those people. He says, all these people are expecting this, but I have more joy in my heart than all of them. And so he makes a contrast here, and he expects a real difference between those that are genuinely calling out to God and those that just want good things from God. He says there's a contrast between the results you get and the results that I get. And you need to expect a real difference when you pray. Have you ever heard that atheistic argument that prayer, you can pray to a jug of milk and you'll get all the same answers? The idea is, when you pray to God, God will give you 3 answers every time. He'll say yes, He'll say no, He'll say wait. And you can pray to a jug of milk, and guess what? You'll get those same 3 answers, yes, no, or wait. This is an accusation against the greatness of God and the reality of prayer. And this is perpetuated by believers who have a safe faith and a very shallow view of prayer. When you pray and call out to God, you need to expect a real difference, external and internal. There's going to be a difference when you call out to God and when God answers. Sometimes God answers in a way that's spectacular and overt, and it's external, and it cannot be denied, and you know, and everyone around you knows, if God hadn't acted, that wouldn't have turned out the way that it did. But in verses 7 and 8, we see more of an internal difference that David expects and receives. In verse 7 he says, you have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abounds. When they have everything to be happy about, I have more joy even in my suffering than they do. Can you testify to that? Lord, I'm feeling in my prayer, here's the difference. My prayer doesn't find only value in the result. My prayers find value in the communion I find with God as I pray and wait for an answer. So their wine and grain may abound, but I have more joy even in my distress. He says internally, not only that, what does he have? I have peace and I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. I have joy, I have peace, I have security. And this takes us back to 2 Samuel after he has abandoned the palace, after he's been assaulted by Shimei. Verse 14 says, "And the king and all the people who were with him arrived weary at the Jordan, and there he refreshed himself." The Lord provided for him. As our worship team comes forward, I just want you to think about one more connection here. As we seek to model David's behaviors in our lives, endurance, expressing confidence in God, exhorting others to righteousness, expecting our prayers to make a real difference in our lives and in our circumstances, these behaviors, piloted by David, were infallibly, certainly sealed by another man in the exact same location 1,000 years later. In 2 Samuel it says he was ascending the Mount of Olives. At the foot of the Mount of Olives is the Garden of Gethsemane, where another man knelt and prayed and called out to God for an answer. And while he was waiting on that answer, in fact, he did get, listen, not right now. This cup is yours to drink from. Not the answer he was looking for, but in that suffering, in that turmoil, your righteousness was purchased when Christ died on the cross. God's Son prayed in the garden. The answer was delayed. Your righteousness was purchased. Many sons and daughters were brought to glory. And then later on, after the resurrection, it was from that mountain that he ascended into heaven. And so we have this pattern, started by David, cemented by Christ, meant to be on display in our lives. Who knows what God might do through you in your suffering, what he might do to you in his suffering by Christ as you wait for him to answer your plea.